Hello, welcome again. I'm Larissa Huff, the Communication and Program Specialist at the Wharton Esherick Museum. I am here to introduce Katie's Spotlight Talk. And before we get started, I just want to mention that we have an upcoming blog that should be up today or tomorrow about self-portraiture, a little bit more. So to continue our theme of home is self, you can check out our previous blog posts, and we have an upcoming talk with Virginia Blanchard on August 4th at 3 p.m. If you weren't at Katie Hudnall's talk, or other artist talk that we had in regards to home as self, it's up on our website and it's super, super great. So we hope to see you all at the Virginia one too. But for today, we're just gonna listen to all that Katie has to share about Wharton Esherick's self-portrait. So I'll hand it over to you, Katie.
Great. Thank you so much, Larissa. And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I will jump right in because it's a short talk and there's always more than we can ever, we can only fit so much in 20 minutes. So I will share my screen and let's see, make sure I've got this here. Okay. Everybody can see that, hopefully. So, so we're talking about the self-portrait because it is sort of a theme of the year. Our annual juried woodworking show is up right now, Home as Self, where we were sort of thinking broadly about what a self-portrait can be. Esherick often talked about his own building, the entire studio, as a sort of autobiography. So we can think about self-portraits in this really large way. We can think about them in this very traditional way, which is the painting that I'm going to be talking about today, his self-portrait from 1919. And I think it really is going to give a deeper understanding of his personal and artistic path, and just how boldly he departed from his formal training. That was something that I got excited about as I was pulling this talk together. And it's also really a window into an interesting moment in his life where he's transitioning from being a painter into being a woodworker. He doesn't quite know it yet when he does this painting, but he's really on course to really take on some very different materials and different approaches to his artwork. So I just dropped this photo in the intro slide here because I think it's interesting that most folks who come on a tour, this is probably the first likeness you catch of him. And you're seeing him, as I was just saying, in this moment where he hasn't likely even conceived of building the studio yet. And so you have this look back towards this very traditional background, and he's sitting in the context of this sort of wildly imaginative space that he would end up building in the years to come. So let me just head forward here. So here's the self-portrait. As I said, it's done in 1919, hangs on the wall of the studio. He's in his early 30s here, wearing a very traditional painter's smock. We can see there's a door in the background. There's a windowsill, looks like brushes or maybe pencils on the surface back there. You can see some light coming in from the side of the room. Up in the top corner there, you can see a signature. He's got his middle name in there, Harris. So Wharton Harris Esherick, 1919. He would drop that as he became a woodworker. But in a lot of his paintings, especially the earlier ones, you can see him using his full sort of more formal name there. And the painting has this great use of color. You consider it an impressionist style painting. And when you're looking in, for example, in the smock, you can see there's lots of kind of variety in the color there. There's some purples, some orange, some blues. So you can see that he's a really capable painter and has this kind of beautiful rhythm, I think, that the colors make as you observe that, where you see some of those tones that are in, for example, in that smock coming out in the different tones of his face, and then in that window in the back. So, you know, he's clearly very talented as sort of moving your eye through the image plane, kind of giving you somewhere to look. And maybe less obvious here because it's a photograph, but it's very textural. So in that impressionist style, he's using these kind of big, thick paint brushstrokes, getting a lot of texture in there. This was a style that he learned through teachers at PAFA, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts here in Philadelphia, and when he was studying commercial arts at the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Arts, which through different iterations has become the University of the Arts today. So I'm showing here, I thought we could dive into that education a little bit. These are 3 professors that he had when he was studying at UArts: J. Frank Copeland, Herman Dagendash, and Ludwig Faber. And I'm just throwing them in here. They're certainly different than the Impressionist style that the painting is in, but he was really on this track to study something that could have a sort of practical use, which is interesting that he came back that way at the end of his, or later in his career. But Esherick was on an illustration course there. And so he was taking classes like watercolors, drapery, antiques, which would have been him going and sketching plaster figurines and that sort of thing. He also did some printmaking, lithography, silkscreen. And he says that he really leaned into his drawing classes there. He realized that the sort of foundation of everything for him was drawing, and that if he was going to be good at drawing, that would translate to the other sort of, the watercolor, the printmaking, all of that was sort of hinged on that drawing ability. So he said he could be found among the antiques once he realized it was the linchpin for everything else. And he also would talk about how his interest was always to express himself really with a picture or with line at that time. And then when he goes on to study at PAFA, and this is like 1908 to 1910, he is studying with some really important American Impressionists. I'm showing a self-portrait by Cecilia Beaux here, which is one of his painters. He was at PAFA really at the sort of height of Impressionism in America, which was very akin to the European version, which had sort of been brought over to America some years later. So thinking about capturing light, thinking about those sort of open quality to the brushstrokes, often painting out in nature. American Impressionism was a little bit different in that it focused a lot more on portraiture, and often was sort of swept into showing sort of well-to-do social classes and these sort of tranquil scenes, social etiquette, these sorts of things. So that was a little different than the European version. But the people that Esherick was studying with certainly gave him a lot of fodder for the work that he would create after. So in this case, Cecilia Beaux, very, very famous painter. This is another work by her. So I think interested to see where maybe some of her studio habits could have influenced Esherick. So this is just a small oil sort of study on an artist's palette on the left. And then on the right, this is a landscape study that Esherick does on the back of a cigar box lid. And we have in our collection maybe a few dozen of these small works, not all of them on cigar box lids, but I think it really shows a studio habit and the sort of tradition that he may have picked up through teachers like Beaux. Here I'm showing Thomas Anschutz, which is another really prominent, important painter that he had as a professor. He has wonderful, big, fabulous oil paintings. And if you're a fan, you're probably thinking, what, she's just showing this little watercolor. But he did take drawing with Anschutz. And so I thought it was nice to share something that was maybe akin to what he was studying in the course. And I also think it actually somehow looks so much like Esherick's farmhouse, even though it is not. It has this quality of a Pennsylvania house and the kind of light and scene that he may have been inspired to paint from him. Anschutz was a student of Thomas Eakins. So I mentioned that just to share that there's a kind of really a strong lineage of drawing history, and the kind of professors that are handing down knowledge coming down to Esherick is really some of the top people in the country. And then the other teacher I'll mention is William Merritt Chase. I think it was the most interesting to think about in terms of Esherick's work, because he was a bit of a personality. In addition to being a teacher himself, he was a very celebrated American painter and really known as a teacher. So people would maybe pay to, or not pay necessarily, but make a point of going to Chase's studio just to watch him paint, and the sort of speed that he could do it in, the way that he made his decisions with the brushwork. People just really kind of flocked to him. And so Esherick himself, in the oral histories that we have, he was sort of delighted that Chase really thought that Esherick was quite talented. And he says, he's speaking about PAFA, he says, there was a marvelous bunch of teachers there, and Chase thought I was wonderful. As soon as he'd walk into a class of 30 of us, he'd walk over to see what my drawings looked like. He'd say, I've been thinking of you all the way over from New York, William Chase. So Eshericks was sort of exclaiming, like, I can't believe this guy, like the guy is looking at me. I also thought this was an interesting painting of Chase's to look at because, generationally, Chase is significantly older than Esherick when he's studying, and he is, as an American Impressionist, he is showing these sort of social etiquette situations, the woman in this very formal dress, and Esherick probably experienced this kind of a space when he was a young man growing up in West Philadelphia. His own parents were pretty well-to-do, and not that they were involved in the arts, but they would have been accustomed to, having the decorative arts that kind of show your worldliness and sophistication by having things from different parts of the world, and upholding all of the proper formal etiquettes around greeting people in your home and all of these things that Esherick certainly got rid of in his own life. And so I just thought it was an interesting point to think about where he had been coming from in his life and where he was heading, what he sort of tossed out as the new generation of artists when they move forward. And the last thing I'll say about Chase, there's a number of fun quotes you can find about him if you do a little research. He thought he was maybe the father of more art children than any other teacher, which is a fun quote. He also thought, you must enjoy what you're doing if others are to enjoy it with you. And I thought, well, that is not unlike Esherick's own philosophy, to really, if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. So it could be that where Esherick threw out some things from this past generation, he kept, maybe the real crux of it was, how am I going to have fun with this, and how is that going to translate to others? So coming back to the portrait itself, I thought I would just talk a little bit more about where he was in his life when this was done. It's 1919, so he's living in the farmhouse in Paoli. He's been out of school, out of PAFA for almost a decade. In that year, actually, 1919, it's not something we have occasion to bring up very much when we're doing tours, but they actually lost an infant child that spring. So, with that in mind, the painting could take on a very somber tone if we think that it was painted after that loss. And I bring it up also just to wonder, what kind of moment was the family going through when they decided to take a trip to Fairhope, Alabama, which they do at the end of 1919. So really quite a sort of tumultuous year in a way for them. If you've been on a tour with us or read about Esherick, you've likely heard about Fairhope, because it really is this sort of linchpin in his trajectory. They head down there at the end of 1919 to Letty, Esherick's wife, is interested in studying progressive education from a woman named Marietta Johnson. But on the trip, Esherick is exposed to authors, he's exposed to experimenting with woodcuts, really changes the trajectory of his life. But prior to that trip, he is here in the farmhouse, and he is using the octagon schoolhouse at the base of Diamond Rock Hill as his painting studio. So this is actually the building that he's in when he does the self-portrait. So this would be the door that's behind him to his right there. This is probably recognizable to some of you if you have come for a tour at the studio. It's just down at the base of the hill. If you were to go up that road to the left of the studio, you'd be heading up the hill to where Esherick lived. And this was a building that was made as a one-room schoolhouse in the early 1800s by folks who were living in the area, led by a neighbor, Emma, what do I want to say? The restoration of the building was led by a woman, Emma Wurzler, who was a neighbor and rented the space to Esherick when he was interested to have a painting studio. So prior to this, he was actually using a bedroom in the farmhouse as his painting studio. And when his daughter Mary was born, it was time to find a new space to be, turning the bedroom over to her. And he started renting this space down the hill. So in this shot, I'm showing an outing from a number of years back. I think it was 2019, of some staff and docents, volunteer tour guides visiting the building. On the right is Susie Baum, who was sort of downloading all of her amazing knowledge of the building itself to the staff. We actually took this on as part of our organization to help steward this. When the volunteer organization that Susie was a part of felt like it was best for the building to kind of send it over our way. So she is probably standing somewhere in the vicinity of where Esherick was when he does the painting, because the door is just to her left, and that window behind is the one that we see in the painting. This is a building, there's no electricity, there's just the wood stove, so he wasn't here for very long, just from when Mary was born to when he returns from Fairhope. And there are a few pieces to the building that he sort of left his mark as he was helping with the restoration. And these are things that, you know, you could say perhaps he was sort of testing out his ability in the landscape of architecture and building materials and all of that. So he did add a new door to the building. He added new shutters, which you can sort of make out have a diamond pattern. So he's kind of playing with the name of Diamond Rock Hill there. He also poured the concrete floor, which you can see has this sort of radial pattern, you know, kind of nicely paired to the octagon shape of the building. And we believe he also did the ironwork, which on the photo on the left, you can see there's some ironwork on the windows and on the shutters to kind of give a little security to the building. So he may have been involved in that as well. The schoolhouse comes up in a number of other artworks. There's some great woodcuts that show the schoolhouse. On the right here, though, is a painting from the prior year. So you can see a sense of the impressionist style as he applies it to the landscape. This night scene of the schoolhouse with these large oak trees depicted. He did talk a little bit about this painting in his oral histories. He thought it was a pretty good painting. That's what he said. So the tree's still there. I think it's a good painting. So that's one that we can know his thoughts on directly. And here I'm showing just a couple of other Impressionist style paintings from that same year, from 1919. On the left is Apple Orchard. And then on the right is one that he did down in Fairhope of a gully. And so you can see, again, this real pastel kind of softness that he's finding in all of the landscapes that he's painting. And then I just wanted to end talking just a little bit more about Fairhope, because I think that's part of what's interesting about the self-portrait is how he was sort of right on the verge of this big change. And so on the left, there's a photograph of him down in Fairhope with these great tall pine trees behind him, which he later captures in this painting that's in the middle, Moonlight on Alabama Pines. But what's wonderful is that he started to carve the frames for his paintings. In this case, he's got these wonderful kind of pine needles dancing around the edge. So this was a great chance for him to kind of explore, to kind of move beyond the training that he had at PAFA and the museum school. And then he had also, I had mentioned, he met some authors while he was there. Sherwood Anderson was one, and another was Mary Marcy. And she was working on a book about evolution for children. It's sort of all prose. And this is just a few years before the Scopes trial. That's, kind of working out the legal ability to teach evolution in school. So it's this really, so I mentioned that because, it was really at the edge of something. It was not a given that we would be discussing such a topic with kids. So she invited Esherick to do woodcuts, which is his very first woodcuts, to kind of play back and forth off of her writing these poems. And he makes an illustration and she writes a poem and they go back and forth in this way. So I think these are just a couple of examples where he took something like that ethos that Chase was celebrating and that Esherick is celebrating about, you have to be able to enjoy it if others are going to enjoy it. And it seems like in Fairhope, he really starts to do that. He really breaks away from whatever, obligations to tradition he has, and he just starts having fun. He kind of lets loose. And I think that that's what we feel when we end up in the studio, right? We can feel that joy coming through. So with that, I will turn it over to the group if there's comments or questions or anything like that. Anything I may have breezed over, I'm happy to chat about it. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Any questions or comments at all? Anything that I might have missed? I will mention I said this a little bit, but the schoolhouse did become part of the museum, and someday, if not open to the public, we may have a sort of virtual tour component so that you can see the interior of that. It's mostly has been represented as a schoolhouse and not as a painting studio. But there is a table in there that has some paint remnants on it. So we may get some conservator to do a little digging and see if we can tell if those are indeed Esherick's paint marks on Esherick's old painting table.
I've got a question, if I may.
Please.
One of the things that Bob and Ruth shared with me relative to Esherick's time at the Academy was that, as Bob put it, he left the school because he was learning how to paint like the old masters and he wanted to find his own style. Yet you seem to speak about how he was also encouraged by people like Chase and so forth. So it sounds like a mixed dynamic for him.
Yeah, no, I think I've heard the same things. Like, he did leave, maybe it was 6 or whatever, a few weeks before he was going to graduate, saying, I'm going to go, how does Wharton Esherick paint, right? He needed to go find his own voice. He also talks about how lovely his professors were there.
Yeah.
So I think it maybe is him finding out that they're great and it's not quite for him.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
I was always curious about how vehement his leaving was. Did he just I don't want to do this anymore, or did he really thumb his nose at them?
Well, and it's reminding me of when I was the museum school part. I think he started not going to a lot of the other classes because he was always drawing in this other space. So like, again, he wasn't quite doing what the track was requiring him to do. And then I can't remember the context exactly, but we were just uncovering some storytelling around Esherick being a student and being invited to the Barnes Foundation. And he was supposed to go listen to Barnes, and he did not do that. He said, I can learn more from looking at the works in the collection than listening to this guy. And he was escorted out. He got kicked out. So I think it's in that realm of like appreciating the work, and then also really maybe bristling at some of the structure of it.
Which is interesting. I know also Bob Bascom said Esherick was asked sometimes to teach classes when he started to come into his woodworking, furniture making, sculpting. And he said, look, let them come out to the studio and see what I do. They're not going to learn anything by me yammering at them about what I do.
Right. It wasn't in the words for him. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
What informative.
It was a lot of fun to put it together. So thank you. All right. Well, I think we'll be sending around a follow-up email.
Yeah.
And there's maybe a couple links to share to different topics, but otherwise I'll just say thank you everybody for coming out, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.